I love those stories when you're meeting people for the first time, and often you say, well, how did you meet your wife, or how did you meet your husband? And then off they go. We tell this story, and the stories are often pretty amazing. And it's usually about a kind of transformational moment where it's like you see the stranger across the room, and you're intrigued, and then there might be a couple of dates, but the relationship begins to kind of get serious and deepen. And the readings today, certainly the first and the third one, are about this kind of transformational relationship that is happening between God, Jesus, and us. And I just want to kind of connect that. But so we all know what those moments are like. That we meet somebody, it's kind of a mystery. We're intrigued, we're attracted, and it could be a lover, or it could be a mentor. It could be somebody who's going to become our best friend. And what begins maybe superficially over time then deepens in our commitment of time, and in our commitment of love and marriage and fidelity, and walking with that person through our lives. My favorite story in St. Peter's, because I've heard many of the stories of how you've met, particularly your spouses, but my favorite one is the Pitchers, who've been married 60 years. And Sherwood tells the story of when he was a young man, there was a car accident outside his front door, right? You know this story. And your neighbor. And this beautiful young woman arrived at the door and knocked and needed help. And Sherwood said to his parents, I'm going to marry that beautiful young woman. And he did. And it's a great story. So let's look at Samuel. You have this very important figure in the history of Israel. And his birth, I talked a little bit about this on Christmas Eve. The Christmas narrative is colored by the ancient Jewish story of Samuel. So his mother can't have children, and she's kind of ridiculed for that. And she prays to God desperately that she's going to have a child, and she promises that she will give this child back to God. And so Hannah gives birth to Samuel. And her prayer of thanksgiving to God, the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, is very much based on the Song of Hannah. So the early church saw in Jesus a kind of connection between this person who comes out of, we're told that it's a time of kind of, there's no vision. There's nothing to inspire out there right now. And so Samuel is kind of born at a time when the people of Israel needed direction. They needed inspiration. And he goes to work in the temple. The temple at this time is at Shiloh. It's not in Jerusalem. And the people of Israel, they don't have a monarchy yet. They are a confederacy. And so the 12 tribes, this shrine where the Ark of the Covenant is kept, is kind of this national political religious center. And the priest who runs it is an old man called Eli, right? And so he is kind of the spiritual director of this young boy who's kind of like a monk, right? And he's learning, he hears this voice, and he's not sure what it is. And the conversation is that God is actually calling him physically and wanting to be in relationship with him. And Samuel will grow up to have a very important role, and his role is to anoint the first king of Israel, to anoint Saul. And history and identity of the nation of Israel changes because of this person, this young man's role. And so Samuel grows up and becomes very, very important, and history is changed, and that his relationship with God also develops and changes from that time. What I also like about this story is that holy men and women don't often get it right the first time. It took a little while even for Eli to give spiritual direction on how to handle this. And again, we're invited in relationship. We can't figure it out. We're moving in the darkness of journey and so on. The same thing is going on in the gospel today, because you have this encounter, and it's like there is something in this itinerant preacher from Nazareth that for Nathanael is very attractive. And he doesn't understand it, but that there's a kind of, and Nathanael is a very open person. Jesus gives him this compliment: here is an Israelite in whom there's no deceit. He's an open book, no filters. And it's interesting that the relationship with Jesus begins out of cynicism, right? Think about your birthplace, right? And imagine, like, can anything good come out of Belfast? It's kind of cynical. It's kind of a put down. Can anything good come out of Millbrook? And there is this connection with Jesus that Nathanael is intrigued by, and he becomes one of the disciples. So again, our relationship with God and with Jesus, for some of us, it starts in cynicism. It starts in a place that we may not be proud of, or we may not fully kind of grasp. The name Israel means one who sees God. So you have, in John's Gospel, you have there's a lot packed into this conversation, that you have Nathanael who says, you are the King of Israel. In the beginning of John's Gospel, remember that phrase, that he came unto his own and his own received him not. So Nathanael is the counterpoint to that he sees the King of Israel. So like like Samuel, he is anointing Jesus as the new King of Israel. So there's a kind of play going on. And so Nathanael is playing this very important role. He is the model of the new Israel, the description of Jesus, and he's stylized by John. You are the King of Israel. And so he becomes this kind of new Samuel. So that's the lectionary connection today. A chosen people who anoint kings who will change the course of human history in moments of these, beginning with these chance encounters that then develop and deepen. Now, most of us in our spiritual lives, we don't hear the voice of God. And most of us do not meet Jesus in the flesh, who then invites us to follow him. Instead, most of us come to know Jesus or know God from other people. Philip invites Nathanael to meet Jesus, and that's more like how most of us get to know Jesus. Somebody invites us. We are carried as children in baptism. Next week, we're going to baptize Ellery Clark here at the 8 o'clock service. And that's the beginning of a relationship with Jesus. And other people will invite her to church. And maybe, I remember, in my own spiritual journey, I was baptized, but my family, they were happy pagans. We didn't go near church. And I found my way into the church through a youth group. And then I started doing reconciliation work in Belfast. And then my parents went through this really horrible divorce. And the church became my family. And my parish priest became a kind of mentor uncle to me. And that's how I got to know Jesus. I got to know Jesus in other people and in the community that called itself the community of Jesus. And I think for most of us, that's kind of how we move along in this journey, right? And that Jesus is recognized in one another or in some person who is in distress. I love that phrase, Mother Teresa, when she was talking in the early years of AIDS. She said, you know, they are Jesus in a distressing disguise. Very powerful. We see Jesus in many different forms. We see Jesus in reconciliation. We see Jesus in transformation and miracle and people being healed. One of my favorite television programs, and it was so good that the fundamentalist Christian community demanded that it be taken off the air. It was so good. And it's called The Book of Daniel. Some of you remember that. It was with Aidan Quinn, who played this Episcopal priest. His name was Daniel Brewster. And he was a parish priest in northeast, this part of the world, very kind of establishment. His father was an Episcopal bishop. And he was married, a couple of kids. His wife was too fond of the booze. He was kind of playing with Vicodin in his own life as he kind of self-medicated himself to deal with his kids who were doing drugs, and he was dealing with the normal stuff you do in a parish. And so you get to see this guy walk through reality, family life, and life in a parish. And one minute he's dealing with, there's a major fraud that's going on in his church. There's a murder going on in the community. He's at a bedside on a Sunday. He's done church in the morning, and then he's at a bedside where a family is making a decision about turning off life support. And he comes out of the hospital, and he gets in his car in the hospital, and Jesus is sitting in his passenger seat. So Jesus is right there, straight out of Central Casting, the beard and the hair, and Jesus is just kind of present and starts talking to him. How's your day going? What's it like for you? And what's amazing is that the Jesus that this series portrays is this presence that is non-judgmental, isn't trying to fix him, but is a kind of this kind of mentor, unconditional loving presence that he could be totally himself with. And it's wonderful. And as I say, his father is this is the bishop, and Daniel's mother has Alzheimer's and is going through a really difficult time. And there's a moment where the bishop touches her face, and she doesn't recognize him, and she slaps him. And you get this, the pain of what that means. And so he is looking for love in other places, and he is having an affair with his assistant bishop, who's a woman bishop. Connecting the second reading now. That salacious reading. But, in some ways, I think what Paul was celibate. And the context in that reading is that prostitution in the ancient world was sacralized. The idea is you would have sacred prostitutes, men and women, that the whole idea was that this is a way to experience God. And what Paul was talking about is that kind of exchange is not about mutual love, it's about the abuse of power, of male power that buys a woman. And we're seeing that very much in our culture today, in terms of the media's reaction to sexual misconduct and abuse in the workplace. And so that's the context that Paul is condemning, because it's not about a mutuality. It's not allowing this deeper relationship that develops between human beings that is transformational. There's a wonderful moment where usually Jesus will appear in the car, when he's driving along, and there's Jesus sitting in the car, and they start talking. And so Daniel says to Jesus, so does my father ever talk to you? And he said, yeah, he used to, but he doesn't talk to me very much now. He used to. And I think, again, that just in a way in which we are not paying attention to our physical relationships on earth. We're not paying attention to our loved ones, or to our spouse, or to our children, or our grandchildren, or our neighbors. We kind of get off kilter. And that can happen in our spiritual lives too, So this series, it was really great. You can watch it on YouTube. It's still around. But it's very interesting that the fundamentalist evangelical American community hated it because it presented a kind of non-judgmental, the idea that Jesus is that accessible and that we travel in our lives, in the reality of our lives, with Jesus and the community of Jesus. So I hope if you get a chance, you might want to look at that. We have it in the library. Excellent. There we go. Wonderful. So let's think about our relationship to Jesus. And next week, as I mentioned, it's our patron saint day. It's St. Peter's Day. We will be baptizing at 8. And the family, they're bringing water from the River Jordan. Apparently it's been passed down in a bottle. So we'll have some real Jordan water. And we'll keep the font up here so that at the 9:30 congregation, that we will be part of that liturgy. We will be renewing our baptismal covenant as we begin that kind of new year together as a community. And I'm inviting families and the children who are working on their journey to confirmation, as many as can be here, that connection between the font and their journey to confirmation as they get to know Jesus, that we travel with them as a community. So I'm looking forward to that very much next week. I want to end with, this is a little book called At Least 100 Principles of Love. It's written by Nancy Klein and Christopher Spence, who are old friends of mine. And it was written many years ago, and it's these very pithy, powerful, deep reflections on what love means. And I've chosen this one because it resonates with this connection with Samuel and with this connection with Nathaniel and Jesus today. Our relationships are forever. Once you have a relationship with someone, you have it. You may decide to restructure it in order to make it a more accurate expression of what is currently real and mutual between you, but you cannot choose not to have it. What was good in it all along remains good, as in no way rendered invalid or non-existent, because the structure of the relationship has changed. And they go on to say, it is never too late to put things right in our relationships. We do not want to die, nor want the people closest to us to die, without first reestablishing the deepest possible connection. The sooner we take whatever initiative is necessary to accomplish this, the less costly the separation will have been for us. We should live every day in such a way that if the people who have been closest to us were to die, we would have no reason to reproach ourselves for things we did not say or do. Amen. One footnote, it's one of my favorite jokes. It's the story of this kind of fundamentalist Christian, and sometimes we encounter people like this in our lives, And this person is approaching a nun and saying, "Sister, do you know the Lord Jesus Christ?" And the nun says, "I bloody well hope so. I've been married to him for 25 years." Amen.